He entered the market with slow, steady and silent steps. The bell hanging on the door rang softly, almost drowned out by the old radio playing country music in the background. There stood Thomas Hawk Sullivan, 72, walking as he did every morning. His shoulders slightly hunched, his hands buried in the pockets of his old military jacket, the deep, weary look of someone who'd seen far more than he'd ever wanted. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," the young clerk said with a sweet but distant smile. He returned only a slight nod, discreet as always. Thomas walked slowly between the shelves, picking up his usual fresh bread. The market was small and family-run, a simple and peaceful spot in that quiet Texas town, and though everything seemed normal that morning, there was something heavy in the air. Thomas's loneliness was palpable, almost touchable. That small daily trip to the market wasn't just a habit, it was his only way to connect with the outside world. His wife had been gone for over 10 years, leaving a house full of silence. And his son had gone off to war in Afghanistan and never returned. The old soldier felt a tightness in his chest as he held the soft bread in his calloused hands. A sharp memory invaded his mind, the last time he saw his boy alive. A crowded airport, uniformed soldiers coming and going, families saying tearful goodbyes. He hugged his son tightly, trying to ignore the sick feeling that gripped his heart. The young soldier's smile still shone brightly in his memory. "Take care, Dad," were the last words he heard. Suddenly the market door slammed shut. 3 men rushed in, dark clothing and masks covering their faces. A shout tore through the calm air of the place. "This is a robbery, everyone on the ground now." The mood changed instantly. People began screaming and throwing themselves to the ground in despair. Thomas remained motionless, standing in front of the bread aisle, just slowly closing his hand inside his jacket pocket, without showing any reaction. One of the bandits looked directly at him, frowning beneath his mask. "Hey, old man! Are you deaf? Get down on the ground now," he ordered angrily, pointing his gun at him. The cashier's eyes widened, terrified by the scene. Why was this peaceful man challenging the criminals? Didn't this poor old man realize the danger? She whispered softly, anguished, "Please, Mr. Thomas, don't." But Thomas didn't move. At that moment, while everyone saw only a frail and stubborn elderly man defying an armed criminal, no one could have imagined that he had faced far greater dangers. Ambushes in the middle of the desert, rescue missions under heavy fire, extreme training that demanded surgical precision in life-or-death situations. All of this had shaped his mind and body. He was no ordinary man. He was Thomas Sullivan, known as Hawk, the legendary Special Forces veteran, a true war machine trained to act silently and decisively. In that moment, conflicting memories and emotions flooded his mind. The pain of losing his son, the longing for his wife, the emptiness of silent days in his empty house, but above all, something still burned brightly within him, a promise made years ago. "I will not leave this world worse than I found it, son," he promised his son before his final departure. Thomas quickly looked around, assessing the situation with cold, meticulous precision. The hostages were trembling. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. But Hawk remained calm, silent, motionless, his breathing barely perceptible. Have you ever been through something like this, where everything seems about to fall apart, and you need to act quickly, but without revealing your intentions? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because while everyone there saw a helpless and stubborn man, no one knew what that old man was truly capable of. The child's cry echoed between the shelves like an invisible siren. It was a sound that cut through the chest more than any gunshot. An elderly woman, with disheveled white hair and a panicked face, tried to get up, but was roughly shoved by one of the criminals. She fell sideways, hitting her shoulder hard on the corner of the drinks cooler. The sharp crack of the impact shook even the floor. No one moved. No one dared, not even to help. The manager, a slight man in a blue apron and crooked glasses, was dragged by his hair to the cash register. His mouth trembled, his hands waving in the air, pleading for calm. But there was no room for negotiation. The robber holding him hostage was trembling just as he was, the kind of criminal who wouldn't hesitate if he felt he was losing control. And there, control was slipping through everyone's fingers like fine sand. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the scene. Standing motionless between the cereal shelf and the ice cream freezer, he looked like a frightened old man frozen in fear. But anyone who looked closely, and no one there was looking, would realize he was somewhere else. Not in his body, but in his mind. Every scream, every sudden movement, every ragged breath. Everything was processed with a precision you can't learn in books. It was the instinct of someone who survived what they shouldn't have survived. And then a specific sound made him blink. The sound of a gun butt hitting the metal side of the cash register. The startled girl, the clerk who always offered him a sincere good morning, letting out a muffled scream. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a growing threat. Something that could end much worse. The memory came like a dry thunderclap. A desert village, 30 years ago. Civilians surrounded, children screaming. Thomas, younger, more agile, leading the nighttime evacuation along routes known only to him. The fear was the same. The tension, the same. But there was one stark difference. Back then he had a team, he had a radio, he had support. Now he was alone. But he wasn't unarmed. Shame still gnawed at him. The feeling of being too still, too old, too late. As if the world had turned its back on him, leaving him there merely as a spectator to a tragedy waiting to happen. But the truth is, he'd never been good at just watching. He moved his eyes. Millimeters. First to the left, he checked the distance between the aisle he was in and the end of the shelf. Then to the right, he identified the positioning of the 3 criminals. One more nervous, the leader. One distracted in the beverage section, the other more aggressive with his gun pointed at the cashier. This was the most dangerous. Thomas took a deep breath, and as the cold air hit his lungs, something in his posture shifted subtly. His shoulders, previously hunched over time, straightened a bit more. His gaze hardened. Inside, an old code was ignited again. One move, one chance. One mistake, no one comes back. How many times had he thought that phrase silently during impossible missions? The cashier began to cry silently. Tears streamed down her young face and her hands shook so badly she couldn't enter the safe code. The thief angrily slammed the machine. He yelled at her, threatened her. And at that exact moment, Hawk clenched his fist in his pocket. The touch of the army pin, the one he never took off, reminded him of who he was. Not just a survivor, not just a grieving father or a lonely widower, but a man who, despite everything, was still there. Present. Alive. Capable. He still heard the echoes of the promise he had made to his son. I will not leave this world worse than I found it. A phrase spoken between suppressed tears and long hugs on the airport tarmac. And there, in that supermarket lost in the Texas countryside, it returned like a silent command within the chest. Thomas then took a step. Just one. But it was enough to get his adrenaline pumping like old times. His muscles ached. His back screamed. His knees were no longer the same, but the instinct that never left him. And so it was, with the precision of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, that he began moving between the shelves. It wasn't speed, it was strategy. He approached the second criminal, the distracted one. He used the shadows between the aisles, the reflections in the freezer, the loud sound of the leader's threats as a smokescreen for each step. Can you imagine what goes through the mind of someone who learned to survive in absolute silence, who spent entire nights lying in the mud, waiting for the enemy to pass within inches, who saw comrades fall and still stood firm because there was no other choice? Well, Thomas knew what he was doing, but no one else did. Meanwhile, the first bandit, the most aggressive, paced back and forth with his gun drawn, trying to maintain control of the situation. But the truth was, he had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. Now, something inside Thomas flared brighter with each step. It wasn't fury, it was precision, clarity, an almost cold sense that this moment demanded from him everything that remained of his former self. Because sometimes, true transformation happens when all seems lost. And even if his body betrayed his speed, even if the years had passed like an avalanche, there was still within him a kind of strength that was not measured by muscles, but by decisions. And that's exactly why, when he reached out and grabbed a glass bottle from the shelf next to him, Thomas didn't hesitate. Time seemed to stand still for a second. And then, the sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the market. The second bandit fell to the ground before he even understood what had happened. The tension now reached another level. Screams of surprise. One of the customers choked on his own sobs, and the leader of the criminals turned quickly, pointing his gun at the back of the store where no one was visible. But he had no idea what he was about to face. And before everything exploded, tell me something. Do you also feel that sometimes the quietest people are the ones hiding the biggest stories? Comment here. Silence is also strength. And pay attention, because what happens next changes everything. The sound of the bandit's threat echoed through the hallway like a dull thunderclap. "Anyone else want to be a hero here?" he shouted, his gun raised, spinning violently, his eyes blazing, searching for any sign of reaction. People, curled up on the floor, cried voicelessly, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and helplessness. A teenager holding a cell phone was shaking so hard he could barely unlock the screen. The criminal advanced on him brutally. The butt of the gun came down hard, knocking the phone to the floor. The boy cowered, his eyes closed, expecting the worst. It was at that exact moment that Thomas took another step. Subtle, almost imperceptible, like a shadow moving with purpose. But that movement was like a thread of energy coursing through his entire body. His knees groaned, his back ached like an old wound opening up inside. But none of that mattered. The physical pain was a reminder of what he had survived, and also of what he could still endure. In his jacket pocket, his fingers tightened their grip on the army pin. An almost childlike gesture, like a child clutching an amulet. But for Thomas, it was more than an object. It was identity, belonging, legacy. And it was also an anchor, a silent way of telling himself, "You are still here," because there were days and nights when he doubted it. The memory came back strong. The mission in Pakistan. Civilians surrounded. Gunfire streaked through the air like rabid mosquitoes. He and 3 other men infiltrated amidst the chaos, guiding children and women through narrow alleys, using only gestures and visual cues. No radio, no backup, just silence, focus, and courage. They made it out alive, but not all of them. One of his men, Mark, fell 6 feet from the safe zone. Thomas never forgot the sound of the impact, nor the silence afterward. Now, in the market, he felt something similar. That feeling of being surrounded by chaos where every wrong breath could cost lives. But unlike that mission, now he was alone. No team, no plan. Just him, the ache in his bones, and a bunch of innocents waiting for a miracle that might never come. The attacker screamed again. This time he kicked a shelf in anger. The cans fell, scattering across the floor with a metallic clang. He was unbalanced, tense, unpredictable, the kind of man who pulls the trigger before thinking, and that was too dangerous to ignore. Thomas knew what he needed to do, but doing it required more than courage. It required timing. And in this kind of game, the wrong second could spell disaster. He moved once more, this time positioning himself between 2 parallel shelves, one for cookies and the other for cleaning products. He used the reflections from the adjacent freezer as a makeshift mirror. He observed, he calculated, he counted his enemy's steps. And then, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman who had been pushed earlier began to stir. She tried to get up, dizzy, her face bruised. The bandit heard the movement and turned toward her. He brutally pointed his gun. Thomas felt his blood run cold. His eyes narrowed, and in milliseconds time rewound once more. He remembered another woman lying on the floor, but she wasn't a stranger. It was his wife, Margaret, that sudden stroke at home, one random morning. He ran to her, but everything was already crumbling inside. Her eyes, once bright, began to lose their shine, and he, helpless. A seasoned soldier, unable to save the most important person in his life. Seeing that woman now, there on the floor, vulnerable, brought it all back. The pain, the guilt, the regret. But this time, he could do something, and he would. Without hesitation, he grabbed a glass bottle from the shelf. His hands trembled slightly, but the gesture was precise. He advanced through the shadows like a trained predator. One silent step, another with the side of his foot lessening the impact. He approached the second criminal, the one guarding the back, and without anyone noticing, struck him hard on the side of the head. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a muffled gunshot. The man fell unconscious. A customer let out a groan of terror. Tensions flared. The lead bandit spun around to see what was happening, gun drawn, shouting, "Who was that?" But Thomas had already disappeared again, merged into the shelves as part of the market. Now the chaos had shifted. The criminal no longer knew where his enemy was. He began walking more quickly, his steps nervous, his finger on the trigger. He aimed in every direction but saw nothing. Hawk's controlled calm contrasted with the bandit's growing desperation, an invisible shift in positions. Can you feel this kind of reversal? When fear shifts sides. When silent strength begins to assert itself, even without words, even without apparent violence. Thomas was seconds away from acting again, but he knew this next step was the hardest. The last criminal was still in control. And now, with two comrades out of action, he was more dangerous than ever. As he peered through the gaps in the shelves, the old soldier thought of everything he had lost: his wife, his son, his comrades, his youth, his recognition. But there, in that very moment, there was one thing he hadn't yet lost: his mission. And as invisible as he was to others, he knew that the impact of his actions on that market would go far beyond what anyone could imagine. The tension was at its limit. The bandit screamed, growing louder. Heavy footsteps approached, and Thomas took a deep breath, preparing the final move. The moment when everything would be revealed. Write in the comments, "Not every hero needs to be seen," because what happens next will completely transform this story. The sound of breaking glass seemed to suspend time for a second. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Dry, direct, violent. The kind of noise you wouldn't expect to hear in a quiet market in rural Texas. And even without knowing exactly what had happened, everyone present felt it. Something had changed. It was as if the air had become denser, more charged. The second criminal's body fell heavily to the ground, his head hitting the tile floor with a muffled thud. His hands still clawed at the air as if fighting an invisible force. But it was useless. He was already out of action before he realized what had hit him. Some people, huddled in the corner of the store, swallowed their screams. Others hugged each other. One woman even covered her mouth with both hands, trying to contain her convulsive sobs. The silence that followed the impact of the bottle was more terrifying than the robber's own scream moments before. And in the center of this crushing tension, Old Hawk had already disappeared from view, like smoke escaping through the cracks. The most aggressive bandit, the one who had taken the lead from the start, turned abruptly. His face was hidden by a thick cloth mask, his eyes bulging with rage and loss of control. He pointed his gun at the back of the store and shouted, "I swear to God, if anyone else tries to act smart, I'll shoot." But he wasn't sure where the enemy was, and that was the beginning of the end for him. Thomas, on the other hand, was now behind a wider shelf, near the cleaning products section. He bent down with effort, feeling a sharp tug in his back, like a knife stuck between his vertebrae. His body no longer responded as it once had. Age took its toll on every unexpected movement. His joints burned. His breath came in short bursts. But his mind remained sharp as a freshly sharpened blade. A few feet away, a teenage girl shivered, hidden behind the potato display. Her eyes were watery, her face pale. She had been separated from her mother during the rush. She was alone, vulnerable, leaning against the cold metal of the freezer. And the thief saw her. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He stepped forward, his gun already pointed, his steps hurried, tripping over fallen bags. He said nothing. He just marched toward her with the desperation of someone who knew he was losing control of the situation. And when the girl began to cry even louder, Hawk's world became a blur of pain, memory, and instinct. There he saw the image of his own granddaughter from when she was little. She had the same clear eyes, the same innocent fragility. And along with that vision came the weight of absence. They hadn't spoken in years. A silly argument, a separation with no return, and now all he felt was guilt for putting on his uniform before his family, for spending more time at war than at home, for coming back whole on the outside but shattered on the inside. Maybe saving that girl was his only chance at redemption. He struggled to his feet. His knee buckled, but he kept his balance. He grabbed a box of laundry detergent and threw it in the opposite direction. The sound of the packages falling and scattering distracted the bandit for a second that was worth its weight in gold. Thomas advanced, not running, but firm, determined. His footsteps now echoed like those of a man who knew what he was doing, even if his body screamed otherwise. He slipped between the hallways with a speed almost incongruous for his age. And when the criminal turned, trying to understand where the sound was coming from, it was already too late. With a swift movement, Hawk knocked down a broom hanging from a hook and used it as leverage. He struck the thug's hand hard, sending the weapon flying. The man reacted, trying to throw a punch, but was met with a firm, precise armbar, a technique learned decades ago at a military base in Hawaii during hand-to-hand combat training. The bandit fell to his knees. He tried to scream, but Thomas restrained him without excessive violence, just enough to ensure no one else was hurt. The gun slipped toward the cashier, who remained motionless, her face streaked with tears. Thomas looked around. The customers were still on the floor, shocked, motionless, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Silence fell once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence. A silence of relief, of contained victory, of wordless reverence. The old veteran released the bandit slowly, never taking his eyes off him. He picked up the fallen gun and slid it away with his foot. Then he walked to the center of the store, leaning against the shelves with visible exhaustion. His body was taking its toll. His legs threatened to give way. Sweat trickled down his temples. But he remained standing, just as he had promised his son so many years ago. The police hadn't arrived yet, but the market was safe. And everyone there knew, even if they didn't understand how, that the silent man was the reason. Can you imagine what it's like to spend your whole life fighting in silence, without asking for credit, without seeking applause, and still save the day when no one else would be able to? Write it down. Honor makes no noise, because something is about to happen that will completely change the way everyone sees this man from now on. The last bandit's breathing was rapid, uneven, almost panting. He spun in the middle of the store with his gun raised, trying to aim at an enemy he couldn't see. His eyes were red with tension, his fingers trembling, his body dripping with sweat even in the air conditioning. It was desperation taking shape, the collapse of a predator, finally realizing it's entered unfamiliar territory. With each misstep, his authority shattered before the unseen eyes of an opponent who didn't need to scream to be deadly. And behind the shelf of canned goods, crouched with the weight of time on his shoulders, Hawk heard everything. Every misplaced step, every nervous sniff, every shudder of breath that revealed fear, disguised as aggression. That muffled sound between the criminal's teeth was familiar. It was the same one he'd heard during a patrol in Afghanistan, when he'd hidden for hours in the scorching heat, waiting for a group of insurgents to pass, and he'd bided his time, even if it cost him leg wounds and the memory of a comrade who didn't make it. But there, in that simple Texas market, the enemy was different. The setting was different. The pain, no. The memory of his little son, smiling with his chocolate-covered face after a Sunday breakfast, came back like a sweet, sharp blade. "Daddy, how do you know where the bad guys are if you never make a sound?" Thomas smiled at the memory, not out of joy, but out of longing. Longing for the voice, for the innocence, for what was and would never be again. And he replied, as he had that morning, "Because I hear what they try to hide." Then, with an impulse older than any modern tactic, Hawk rose silently. The pain in his back protested. His left leg gave out for a moment, but his focus was absolute. Like an animal poised to pounce, he advanced. Fast, lethal, his left arm wrapped around the bandit's neck in a sharp blow. The sound of his body struggling to resist lasted only 2 seconds. The gun fell, and the criminal, panicked, tried to let out a muffled scream. But before any sound could escape, Thomas leaned in and whispered, You don't want to do this." The tone was calm, almost paternal, but with the firmness of someone who wasn't asking, he was asserting. The bandit froze. His gaze met Thomas's, and what he saw there wasn't weariness, nor old age, nor weakness. He saw an abyss of experience. You saw the wars, you saw the loss, you saw the kind of silence that can't be learned, it can only be survived. And he understood. He dropped to his knees, he raised his hands, he surrendered. It was at that moment that the tension in the air burst like a punctured balloon. The sound of sobbing returned. People were still trembling, but they were beginning to lift their faces. The danger was passing slowly, like a storm that still leaves the sky dark even after the rain. Thomas dropped the criminal to the ground and took 2 steps back. He stood there, breathing heavily. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, and the pain, the real pain, was taking its place. His left shoulder ached as if it had been ripped open from the inside. His hands were shaking, his body was screaming. But he remained standing. That was what his son said he admired about him. "You never fall, Dad." Even when you should. Time began to move again. People began to move. A woman ran to hug her daughter. The manager crawled to the counter, crying like someone who'd just come back from the brink. And then, for the first time that morning, someone truly looked at Hawk. Not in haste, not in judgment, but with reverence. The clerk, the same one who always called him Mr. Thomas, walked slowly toward him. Her eyes were watery, her hands trembling. She stopped less than a meter away from him and for a moment said nothing. She just stared, as if she finally saw who he really was. "It was you, wasn't it?" she whispered. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he inclined his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, as if to say it doesn't matter, but also yes. She smiled with her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," before hugging him tightly. Thomas wasn't prepared for it. The human touch, the gratitude, the warmth of someone seeing him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged again. Not like the old man who buys bread every morning, but like someone who made a difference. The sound of sirens began to draw closer. The patrol car sped around the corner, and red and blue lights began to paint the supermarket shelves. Police officers quickly descended with guns drawn, but all it took was a gesture from the clerk to change everything. She pointed at Thomas and simply said, "It was him." The agents stopped. One of them approached cautiously. He looked at the brooch in his jacket pocket. And then he did what no one there expected. He saluted. He didn't ask for a name, or what had happened. It wasn't necessary. The gesture said it all. The recognition was silent. Because among soldiers, sometimes silence speaks louder than any report. And Thomas didn't answer. He just nodded. The kind of respect that only those who carry the weight of time understand. Have you ever had the feeling that everything you've been through, all the pain you've endured, all the silence you've swallowed, was about to make sense? Comment here. I see what no one sees. Because what happens after that is something no one there could have imagined. The cup of black coffee trembled slightly in Thomas's calloused hands, but not from fear. It was fatigue taking its toll, now that the adrenaline was starting to wear off. He was sitting on one of the plastic stools in the cafe inside the market, exactly where he used to have his coffee every day after buying bread and milk. The same cup, the same silence. Only this time the silence around him was different, heavy, dense, the kind of silence that comes when all eyes are on you, even if no one has the courage to say what they feel. The officers walked through the hallways, speaking quietly, trying to understand what had just happened. 3 criminals immobilized, no shots fired, no injuries among the hostages. It simply didn't make sense on paper. One of the officers approached, a young man in uniform, his hands still dirty with asphalt dust. He stopped in front of Thomas, studied the old man's profile for a few seconds, and only then noticed the small pin pinned to his jacket pocket, a U.S. Special Forces badge, worn with age but still shining with a kind of authority that couldn't be bought. "Sir, thank you for your service," the police officer said, with sudden respect in his voice. Thomas didn't answer. He merely raised his eyes slightly, gave an almost imperceptible nod, and then returned to staring into space. It was as if he were already far away, in another time, another country, reliving scenes no one in that environment would be able to comprehend. The market manager pointed in his direction with tears in his eyes when asked who had stopped the bandits. "It was him," he repeated, as if still in disbelief. Customers slowly emerged from their hiding places, trying to process what they had experienced. Some hugged their children, others simply watched in silence as the man sat with his coffee in his hands, as if nothing had happened, and it was precisely this contrast that caught the attention of a woman near the entrance. She raised her phone and started recording. The camera captured Thomas slowly getting up, adjusting his body, which was already aching in several spots, and walking slowly toward the exit. Unhurried, unposed, no heroic speech, just leaving, as if he were simply going about his daily routine. This video was posted on social media that afternoon. At first it went unnoticed, but within hours, something inexplicable happened. The content went viral. Views soared at an absurd rate. Millions of people began commenting, people from every state of all ages. Some recognized the pin on the jacket. Others were simply moved by the image of a true hero, an ordinary elderly man who saved dozens of lives and wanted nothing in return. Newspapers tried to interview him. Television crews traveled to the neighborhood, but he refused all requests. Thomas returned to his house as he did every day. He went inside, locked the door, hung his jacket on the same hook next to the bookcase, and sat in the worn leather armchair next to the unlit fireplace. On the small wooden table rested an antique photo frame. The image showed him with his son, both in uniform, smiling in a rare moment of peace. Thomas looked at the photo and sighed, as if to say, "You would have done the same, my son." In the days that followed, the small town became a national topic. The store installed a simple but striking memorial plaque at the entrance. "In this store, a true hero protected us in silence." And it was this phrase that touched even more hearts, because, in practice, it spoke volumes about something we've lost. The idea that true strength doesn't require shouting, that there's a difference between making noise and making an impact. Behind the scenes, neighbors began to uncover stories they'd never heard before, that Thomas had served in 3 war zones, that he'd participated in rescue operations in hostile territories, that he'd lost his son in the same war he fought, that he'd lived alone ever since, and that, even after everything, he never failed to stop by the market every morning just to wish his customers a good day. This alone spoke volumes about the kind of soul he carried. But the most curious thing of all was what happened days later. A well-dressed woman appeared at the market door. She was a reporter. She tried to chat with him at the entrance to the neighborhood bakery. He simply listened, waited for her to finish her question, and then responded with a single sentence. "It wasn't for me, it was for them." And he started walking again. The video of this response also went viral, because truly, people are hungry for this kind of authenticity. In an age where everyone screams for attention, there's something sacred in the silence of those who act, of those who carry the world without spreading the weight. It's as if Thomas Sullivan's entire journey took on new meaning in that market, not just because of the action itself, but because of the symbolism. A forgotten veteran who, on any given day, saved an entire community, and yet returned home as if nothing had changed, as if it were all just part of the mission. But what no one knew was that that morning had left a new scar on him, not on his body, he was used to that by now, but on something deeper, something connected to how he perceived his own worth, because for the first time in a long time, he was seen, not as a burden on society, not as a grumpy old man, but as someone who matters, who still has something to offer, who still has a role to play. And maybe, just maybe, it awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. Write in the comments, the world still needs men like this, because there is one last thing that happened that no one imagined. The market doors creaked open as usual that morning. The light breeze carried the scent of fresh bread and flowers, newly placed in makeshift vases beside the entrance. The sound of slow, steady, familiar footsteps echoed across the polished floor. It was him, Thomas Sullivan. His coat zipped up to his neck, his hands in his pockets, his gaze direct and serene. The same presence as always, but now in everyone's eyes with a different meaning. On the facade, right next to the faded sign, the newly installed metal plaque gleamed in the timid sunlight. In this store, a true hero protected us in silence. It was simple, but it was enough. Anyone who passed by stopped, read, took a deep breath. Many didn't even know exactly who he was, but they knew enough. That an ordinary man, invisible for so long, had saved dozens of people without asking for anything in return. And that touched them more deeply than any medal. Inside, the activity had returned to normal. The shelves were full again. The radio played the same old country music station, and the customers chatted in hushed tones, as if the place now deserved a different kind of respect. When Thomas entered, no one rushed to greet him. No one surrounded him with applause. There were no flashes of light, just glances, lingering glances, muted gratitude, silent recognition. The clerk was the first to break the silence. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said, as she always did. But there was something in her voice, a sparkle in her eyes, a care in her tone. He noticed. And she smiled, discreetly, almost imperceptibly, like someone receiving a gift without wrapping paper but with meaning. He picked up his usual bread and chose the milk with the same calm. His body still ached. His shoulders felt heavier. His left knee insisted on bothering him, but something felt different inside, as if an invisible weight had been rearranged, still present, but now positioned so it no longer crushed him. As he waited in line, a child watched him from afar. A boy of about 7, with messy hair and worn Velcro sneakers. He couldn't take his eyes off Thomas, and when he realized he was being noticed, he made a small gesture. He raised his hand in salute, like he'd seen in a movie. Thomas didn't immediately return it. He just stared at him with a mixture of tenderness and pain. That gesture, so simple, brought back memories that came like a tide. His son, in the garden at 5, playing soldier. His laugh. The way he said "mission accomplished," even when he was just picking up leaves from the ground. That disarmed him more than any weapon. But then, almost without thinking, Thomas raised his right hand, placed 2 fingers at eyebrow height, and returned the greeting. The boy smiled and ran into his mother's arms. That might seem banal to outsiders, but for him, it was enough to shake his foundations, because there was confirmation of something he never expected to feel again. Influence. Not the kind of influence that comes from the spotlight, but the quiet influence of those who inspire, of those who show, through their actions, that courage, honor, and discipline still matter. In the days that followed, more people began approaching him spontaneously, not to flatter, but to listen. A man from the station asked to sit at the coffee table with him. A neighborhood teenager asked for advice on a military career. Even the priest from the small local church stopped to ask if he'd like to participate in the Memorial Day celebration. And Thomas's response was the same as always, a restrained nod, a slight smile, and a "only if you have to sit in the back, listening." The most curious thing was what came next. One afternoon, upon returning from the market, he found an envelope in his mailbox. No return address. Inside, just a handwritten letter and an old photograph. The letter was from a man named Michael West. He claimed to have been saved by Thomas on a mission in northern Iraq in 1992. The photo showed a group of soldiers, dirty, sweaty, but smiling. Thomas was there, in the center, young, but with the same eyes. At the end of the letter, a sentence, "You may not remember me, but I never forgot you." He read it sitting on the porch step, and for the first time in many years, he cried, without noise, without exaggerated gestures. He just let the tears fall onto the paper, as if returning to that message everything that had been bottled up for so long. This was the turning point no one saw coming, the exact point where he, without saying anything, began to accept that maybe there was still time. Time to heal, time to reconnect, time to teach what the world had forgotten. And as the days passed and the city resumed its rhythm, Thomas continued going to the market. But now, something in him, was slowly changing. A detail in his walk, a gleam in his eye, as if the old soldier, after so many internal and external battles, had finally found a new kind of mission, one that didn't depend on orders nor uniforms, just presence. Comment here. There is still value in silence. If you've stuck around this far, it's because something in this story truly touched you. Maybe it was Thomas's silence, or the way he did everything without asking for anything in return. Or perhaps it was simply the reminder that people like this still exist, those who protect, who inspire, who don't give up, even when no one is looking. If this content resonated with you, if it made you feel something, leave a like here. This helps us understand that it's worth continuing to bring stories like this, which aren't just about war, but about humanity. And if you'd like to hear more stories in this same spirit of honor, courage, and purpose, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is a reminder that, even on ordinary days, extraordinary lives still exist. Oh, and if you made it to the end, comment below. Silence is also an answer. Just so I know you walked with me this far, there's a video right here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow along. The next story will also leave an impression on you.